This is Kim Keys, recording this in Greenbelt, Maryland. I'd like to talk to you about a book that I recently checked out of the library. It's a memoir that was co-written by Steve Jones and Ben Thompson called Lonely Boy, Tales from a Sex Pistol. Steve Jones was the guitarist in the notorious 1970s punk rock band the Sex Pistols, whose contributions tended to be overshadowed by the band's provocatively outspoken lead singer Johnny Rotten and the equally provocative bassist Sid Vicious. The reason why I picked this book was because I was a teenager when the Sex Pistols became a big deal in their native UK. I remember the news media in the US doing stories about this band and how loud and raucous they were. I picked up a copy of their debut album, Never Mind the Bollocks, Here's the Sex Pistols, which was a revelation for me. That's because the rock stations in my area played bands like Pink Floyd and Led Zeppelin, while the top 40 stations played mostly disco hits, like by the likes of the Bee Gees and Donna Summer. The Sex Pistols were unlike anything I had heard on the radio at the time. I also heard people around me, especially certain adult relatives and teachers, saying that the Sex Pistols were just a fad that was destined to fade. They ended up being wrong, since many later bands like Nirvana and Guns N' Roses had cited the Sex Pistols as a major influence. And that band was even inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame a few years ago. This isn't the first Sex Pistols related books I've ever read. I've previously read John Savage's England's Dreaming and Johnny Rotten's memoir titled Rotten, No Irish, No Blacks, No Dogs. I picked up this book at the local library because I was interested in getting Steve Jones's take on the Sex Pistols. The book's title is from a song of the same name that Steve Jones wrote during the waning days of the Sex Pistols. Steve Jones has a sense of humor that he frequently displays in the book as he recounts his past, starting with this brief excerpt from the first chapter. One thing I can promise you is that I won't be pontificating about how everyone else needs to get sober. I don't give a fuck if other people want to get high. I've had my go, and now it's your turn. Knock yourself out if that's what you want to do. Of course, if someone else can relate to my experiences, and by some miracle that helps them to be less of an arsehole than I was, then that's all well and good. But I don't want to be that cunt where it's like, oh, he was a rock and roller, but now he's telling everyone else how to live. Fuck that preachy guy. He's the last person I want to be. The book is divided into 3 sections, before, during, and after. As you can guess, the before section focuses on Steve Jones's early years. He was born in London in 1955 to an unmarried 20-year-old woman. His biological father left when his mother became pregnant, and Steve Jones wouldn't meet him for the first time until he was well into adulthood. Jones described his childhood as mostly awful. He graphically describes in full detail the times he was sexually assaulted by both his stepfather and by the neighborhood child molester. Scenes which will definitely trigger anyone who has ever gone through something similar. He also struggled academically in school. All of these factors led to his early juvenile criminal career as a burglar who frequently stole items from various stores. There was one humorous story that Jones recounted during those years. Early on in my thieving career, I had a decent track record of not getting caught. One time when I was still no more than 12, I was shoplifting in Selfridge's department store, one of my favorite West End haunts, when his geezer goes, "Oi!" I thought he collared me, but gradually I realized he just wanted a sweet, excited kid to demonstrate a toy for a story in the paper. It was called a Johnny Astro, and was essentially a balloon that you had to land on the surface of the moon using the air from a fan. You can see the suspicious look on my face in the photo they took, because I still can't believe I'm not nicked. The fact that this photo appeared in the Sun was just icing on the cake. This was my first appearance in the tabloid press, but it wouldn't be my last. And you can see the photo. He did print the photo in his book. which has a caption, "A narrow escape of Selfridges." At the time, I didn't realize how young I was. The only thing that saves Steve Jones's childhood from being totally bleak are the other people who were in his life besides his mother and stepfather. He became friends with future Sex Pistols drummer Paul Cook, and Jones would frequently spend the night with Cook's family as well as with the families of his other friends. He also discovered Jimi Hendrix's music when he heard one of his neighbors playing Purple Haze on a record player, and he went to that neighbor asking about that record he had just heard. That incident resulted in music becoming a major influence in Jones's life. The before section ends with Steve Jones, Paul Cook, and a couple other neighborhood pals named Warwick Nightingale and Del Nunes using the musical instruments that Steve Jones acquired through his robbery escapades and forming a band in 1973 known as the Strand, which formed the nucleus of what would later become the Sex Pistols. The During section deals with the rise and fall of the Sex Pistols. The During section is the longest and most interesting section in the book because Steve Jones not only provides detailed memories of his time in the Sex Pistols, where he dishes about his bandmates, but he also name drops people he met who would go on to become big names in punk rock and new wave music, such as Chrissie Hynde of the Pretenders, who also wrote the introduction to Jones's book. He also recounts the rock stars such as David Bowie, whose shows he went to, where he would sneak backstage and steal some of their musical instruments and other equipment. At one point, Steve Jones waxes philosophically about the nature of most rock bands. However different their music might be, all bands are basically the fucking same. The reason I still, to this day, love watching documentaries about bands like the Eagles, I know they're technically just Eagles, but that looks stupid written down, is that I can totally relate to them. The personalities involved and the reasons for the tensions between them never seem to change. The singer, because that job requires a kind of person who wants to be in the front going, look at me, will almost always be very insecure and usually a bit of a cunt. Then there's the guitarist who wants to get all the pussy, and there's always at least one weird introvert in the band. For me, in the Pistols, it was Cookie. It's quite unusual for that person to be the drummer, but that was good for us because drummers are the ones who tend to come unstuck. I think it's cause no one really gives a shit about them, and they're just sitting out the back. It gets to them after a while, the same way it does with goalkeepers in football. And here's what Steve Jones had to say about his bandmate, Sid Vicious. From the minute Sid joined the band, nothing was ever normal again. I get it that it was great the way him and John looked together, and the media frenzy certainly sold a lot of newspapers, but as far as I was concerned, that wasn't what the Sex Pistols were meant to be. I had in mind being second fiddle to John, but now I was playing third fiddle to this fucking idiot. Maybe even fourth, if he went along with Malcolm's increasingly delusional certainty that we were all his puppets. It wasn't so much that my pride was dented, though that was part of it. It was more than just being around this fucking chaos. That night at the Marquee, the year before when John hurt himself for the first time, I told the guy from the NME, we're not into music, we're into chaos. I was proud of that one at the time, and it's still a blinding line, but I found out afterwards that it wasn't really true. Be careful what you fucking wish for. I was into music. We all were. Not just Rotten playing his Van der Graaf generator on Capitol Radio, but now we got chaos, and it was shit. As I was reading the book, I got the impression that Steve Jones had a role in the Sex Pistols that was similar to George Harrison's role in the Beatles, in that he was a talented guitar player and songwriter who was overshadowed by his bandmates. In Harrison's case, it was because John Lennon and Paul McCartney were the more dominant members whose songs tended to be favored over Harrison's own music. In Steve Jones's case, he was more overshadowed by his bandmates' looks and antics, both on stage and off stage, than by whatever musical and songwriting talent they possessed at that point. Steve Jones shares what he says is the biggest lesson he learned from his time in the Sex Pistols. I guess the one lesson you can learn from it all will be about trusting who you're with and not trying to be too controlling, because the magic was always the bit that none of us could control. We just didn't know how to handle how big we became after Grundy, really. We were like those fucking idiots who win the football pools, then blow all the money, and end up committing suicide. The During section ends with the Sex Pistols' last concert on a U.S. tour in San Francisco. The after section of the book starts off with Steve Jones, Paul Cook, and Sid Vicious filming The Great Rock and Roll Swindle, which was basically Malcolm McLaren's version of the Sex Pistols story. The Sex Pistols were pretty much done after The Great Rock and Roll Swindle was released. Steve Jones and Paul Cook stayed together as they worked on another movie. Then they formed a band called The Professionals, which lasted a few years. It was also during this time when Jones himself became a heroin addict. He devotes a large section of the book detailing what it's like to have an addiction that's so bad that he would spend a large part of his days thinking about how he was going to get money to get heroin, then finding a dope dealer. Here is how he describes the experience in his book. There were times when walking down there to cop what was the last thing I wanted to do. But when you're sick for the dope, you've got no choice. It was scary, but I knew I had to do it. The thought of getting high was all that was keeping me going. There was no joy coming from anywhere, but at least I knew what the point of me was. This is going to sound pretty fucking weird, but being a junkie felt like a necessity after the Pistols ended. It would be crazy to say it saved my life, but that kind of is how I feel about it. It's never the down and outs that kill themselves. It's always the ones who've had something and lost it. I'm lucky that I've never had coherent suicidal feelings in my life, and you can't imagine what that feels like if you've never been to that place. But the hole inside me was yawning so wide that fuck knows what else I'd have filled it with if I hadn't had heroin. Eventually he moved to California, where he joined a couple of short-lived bands and even released a few solo albums. His fortune began to change when he kicked both heroin and alcohol. He became a DJ on a radio program called Jonesy's Jukebox, which people who live outside of Los Angeles can access online. He also participated in a few Sex Pistols reunion tours. The book ends on a high note. He also has this to say about his current philosophy of life. It's all so irrelevant anyway when you think about the endless fucking size of the universe. Here we are, these tiny little ants, self-importantly talking about why Wally got the sack from Swankers, but when the ants come into my house, I get to spray out and murder about 20,000 of them. I'm like the Himmler of ants. In their world, they're probably arguing about who's not doing their ant chores. Then I come along and press a button and they're gone. This is just the kind of inspirational stuff you want to be reading in the last chapter, isn't it? I don't believe in sugarcoating things. I found the book very enjoyable despite the harrowing moments regarding the sexual abuse and dealing with Sid Vicious as a bandmate. If you like the Sex Pistols, you'll definitely love this book. It's an easy read, and I was able to finish it in about a week. Anyway, that's it for this book review. This is Kim Key signing off now. Goodbye.